In the winter of 1842, in the soot-choked valleys of Yorkshire, a coal pit swallowed nearly every working man in a single night. The women wept, the bells tolled, but the children, those small silent figures left behind, would soon face a fate far darker than hunger and far crueler than death. They were gathered together, locked away, and erased from every parish record. What happened in that pit was never written in history, until now. This is the forbidden tale of the Pit Miners Orphans, a story the parish refused to acknowledge and the ledgers never recorded. Dozens of children vanished without graves, without names, without prayer. Tonight, we unearth the fragments, letters, testimonies, and whispers that survived the parish fire. And as you listen, remember, history's silence is rarely empty. Welcome to the macabre record. If these untold shadows of history keep you listening, make sure you subscribe. And before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The parish books tell us much about life in the valley, but their silence tells us more. The ledgers of births and deaths, baptisms and marriages stand like a careful map of a community. They record men sent into the earth each morning, children christened in icy fonts, widows remarried in plain wooden chapels. The ink speaks of hunger, of typhoid, of accidents beneath collapsing beams. And yet, between the lines, whole families vanish into silence. A son with no funeral, a daughter with no grave, a generation with no place on the page. It was one of those winters where even the crows grew thin. The ground was iron, the sky heavy with smoke from chimneys that never ceased, and the pit that had fed the village for decades, grumbled like a beast half asleep. Men went down with lamps and pickaxes, leaving behind wives at their washtubs and children chasing each other in soot-lined streets. They sang as they descended, voices rough but hopeful, for the mine was both death and bread. It gave nothing without taking something in return. But the ground had been restless that month. A tremor shook the cottages in December, rattling crockery and spilling milk. Old women muttered that the pit was hungry, that the earth demanded payment beyond the wages of flesh. The priest laughed at such talk, warning the parish not to dabble in superstition. Yet the people whispered anyway, for superstition in such places was not a luxury, but a shield. They spoke of strange echoes beneath the soil, echoes that did not match the swing of pickaxes or the fall of coal. Echoes that seemed to breathe. And still, the men descended. Children waved at their fathers, never knowing it would be the last time. No one in the valley could have guessed that the mine would claim them all in one night, and that the children left standing in the street would be carried not to safety, but to a darkness far deeper and far less forgiving. The valley before the collapse was a place of harsh rhythm, its days ruled by the bell of the parish and the siren of the mine. Every morning before dawn, the men walked in a slow procession to the shaft, their boots clattering over frozen stones, their lanterns swaying like stars swallowed by fog. Behind them lingered their children, who knew the ritual well. They stood barefoot in the frost, half asleep, hair tangled, clutching the hands of mothers too weary to scold them. The air always smelled of iron, smoke, and damp earth, and though it was bitter and bleak, it was the only air they had ever known. The cottages leaned into one another like conspirators, their roofs dripping soot-black rain, their chimneys vomiting smoke that fell as ash upon every sill. Inside, rooms were dark and close, walls stained with years of damp, voices muffled by hunger. Coal dust touched everything, from the crust of bread to the seams of clothing. No corner of the valley was untouched by it. Even the church pews bore black smudges where men's hands had rested during prayer. The mine was not a place beneath the village. It was the village, its shadow woven into every life. Children, though pale and underfed, laughed easily in those brief hours between dawn and dusk. They splashed in gutters when thaw came, stole crusts from one another with quick hands, played games that turned cobblestones into imagined kingdoms. They mimicked their fathers with wooden sticks as makeshift pickaxes, swinging at invisible seams of coal, laughing at each other's crooked stances. Their voices lifted into the fog, bright but brittle, as though the earth might swallow them if they grew too bold. Yet there was always an unease, a tension no game could entirely dissolve. At night, when the fires in hearths dwindled and the wind sighed through the valley, mothers would tell stories to quiet their children, not stories of saints or kings, but of the mine itself. They whispered that the pit was alive, that the earth beneath their homes shifted not by chance, but by hunger. They told their little ones not to wander near the shaft after dark, for the mine might mistake them for its due. It was a way of keeping children safe, or so they claimed, though the look in their eyes suggested they half believed it themselves. A week before the collapse, a strange sound shivered through the shaft. The men said it was nothing but settling stone, the groan of old timbers. But one miner swore it sounded like a sigh, as if the pit itself exhaled beneath their feet. Another insisted he heard knocking, though no hammer struck at that hour. Such talk was quickly hushed. The overseers did not tolerate weakness, nor whispers of curses. Still, word passed quietly from lip to lip, carried home on weary tongues. By Sunday's service, every mother's hand was clenched tighter around her child's shoulder, though no one would admit why. Life went on, because it had to. Bread still needed baking, shirts still needed mending, candles still needed to burn. And yet the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The children still played in the dirt, and the men still went down into the earth, but an invisible shadow had fallen across them all. The mine was restless, and though no one dared say it aloud, the valley knew it was only a matter of time before the earth would take what it wanted. It happened in the dead of night, when the village was wrapped in uneasy sleep. The air had been strangely still all evening, the kind of silence that presses against the ears until one cannot tell whether the world has gone quiet or whether something enormous is listening. Dogs whined at doorways, lamps flickered without draught, and then, without warning, the ground began to tremble. Crockery rattled from shelves, glass chimneys of lanterns toppled and burst, and mothers clutched their children as the earth groaned beneath them like some vast animal stirring in its lair. From the direction of the pit came a sound no living man had heard before. It was not the sharp crack of timber or the clatter of stone, but a deep and rolling thunder from below, as though the belly of the world had torn open. A single shriek rang out from the shaft, carried on the wind, then was cut off so suddenly it seemed the voice had been swallowed whole. Windows flung open, doors banged, and men stumbled into the freezing street half-dressed, their faces pale in the moonlight. The mine had collapsed. By the time villagers reached the shaft, nothing remained but a yawning mouth belching dust. The timber frame had splintered, beams torn loose like snapped bones. A cloud of black smoke and choking grit poured upward, so thick it blotted out the stars. Mothers screamed their husbands' names into the night, but no voices answered. The earth sealed itself again, and silence fell heavy and absolute, broken only by the sobs of those who knew in their marrow that no one would return. They tried to dig. With shovels, with bare hands, with whatever they could grasp in their grief, they clawed at the rubble. But the shaft had caved in hundreds of feet below. Stones slid, beams cracked, and each attempt only seemed to bury the dead deeper. The overseer shouted for calm, his voice trembling, promising that men would be sent from the next county to aid in rescue. Yet the villagers knew rescue was a word meant to keep despair from spilling into violence. There would be no survivors. The bells of the parish tolled by morning, their sound flat against the grey sky. Rows of widows stood in the frost, shawls pulled tightly around them, clutching children too shocked to weep. Fathers, brothers, sons, all entombed in the cold dark of the earth, their bodies unrecoverable, their graves the very mine that had fed them. For a valley already gnawed thin by poverty, this was more than tragedy. It was obliteration. Entire households extinguished, families cut off at the root. But the collapse, terrible as it was, would not be remembered as the greatest horror of that winter. The mine claimed the men quickly, in one terrible breath, but it was the children left behind who would suffer a slower, crueler fate. They stared at the shaft with wide, glassy eyes, as if some part of them already sensed that their fathers had not been the only offering demanded that night. Something had stirred in the deep, something had noticed them. The days that followed were shrouded in smoke and silence. The bells of the parish tolled until their metal mouths cracked, their sound carrying across hills where no one dared to sing. The valley became a place of processions, rows of black-veiled women clutching children whose eyes seemed older than their years, lines of villagers shuffling behind empty coffins, nailed shut, though no bodies lay inside. The earth had swallowed their dead too deep to recover, and so they buried symbols instead. Shovels, helmets, or lanterns laid reverently in wooden boxes. Priests intoned prayers over hollow graves, their voices hoarse, echoing against the frosted stones of the churchyard. The children stood silent during these ceremonies, hands clasped tightly together, lips pressed thin. Some still scanned the faces in the crowd, as though refusing to believe their fathers were truly gone, waiting for them to step forward out of the mist. But the mist gave nothing back. Only the older ones, the ones already hardened by hunger and winter's cruelty, seemed to understand. They did not weep. They watched. Behind the solemn rites, something darker churned. The mine owners met with parish elders in locked rooms, shutters drawn, candles burning until the wax ran to the floor. They spoke in hushed voices about the future, about order, about keeping the valley alive. Widows could not work the pits. The poorhouse could not absorb so many mouths. Already there were too many begging at the market, too many pale faces crowding at chapel doors. "The children," someone whispered, though none would admit to it later. "The children must be seen to," the phrase became a refrain. Seen to. Not cared for, not sheltered, not raised. Seen to. And with each repetition, the meaning grew colder, until it no longer sounded like kindness, but like necessity. Mothers pleaded for mercy. They begged the parish to let their children remain at home, promising to sew, to scrub floors, to take in washing. But grief makes the weak pliable, and authority was stern. Priests assured them it was temporary, that the little ones would be kept together until proper arrangements could be made. They spoke of food, of shelter, of safety from the bitter winter. And so, one by one, broken women surrendered their children into the hands of the parish, kissing feverish foreheads and pressing scraps of cloth or charms into small fists, as if such tokens could protect them. The streets of the valley echoed with the sound of weeping as pale processions of orphans were led away. No one knew exactly where they were being taken. The constables walked in silence, eyes lowered, guiding the children with heavy steps. Behind curtains, neighbors whispered. Some claimed they saw wagons rolling toward the old shaft at night, lanterns swinging, the wheels muffled with cloth. Others said they heard the clink of iron locks being fastened. But no ledger would record the place, and no parish man would ever speak of it again. They came for the children in small groups, never all at once. A knock at the door, the heavy tread of boots on stone, the dim glow of a lantern spilling across the threshold. Mothers, worn hollow by grief, opened their doors with trembling hands, clutching their little ones to their skirts. The men at the door, priests, constables, and mine overseers, spoke with voices that were soft, but without mercy. "It is for their good," they said. "They will be cared for, sheltered, kept warm until the spring." The children were gathered with promises, but the promises were thinner than the winter air. Some clung to their mothers' waists, screaming until their voices broke, dragged away with fingers clawing at the wood of the doorframe. Others, too stunned to resist, simply stared with wide, glassy eyes, letting themselves be led as though already half gone. The streets filled with small figures moving in solemn lines, carrying ragged dolls or scraps of bread, each clutching the last fragments of a life that would not follow them into the dark. Neighbors stood behind curtains and watched. None dared step forward, though some whispered prayers as the processions passed. For every child taken, there was a silence left in the house, a silence that stretched like a wound. A mother's sobbing could be heard through thin cottage walls, the sound carrying down alleys and across fields, mingling with the howling of winter winds. The first to arrive at the shaft were met with the black mouth of the abandoned pit, boarded years before after another disaster. It stood half-hidden by brambles, its frame rotted, timbers sagging like a jaw with broken teeth. To the children, it looked less like shelter than a maw waiting to consume. Lanterns swung above them, shadows flickering along the walls, casting their small faces in stark relief. A priest muttered a blessing, though his voice faltered as he stared into the darkness below. The descent was slow, the stairs damp and groaning beneath every step. Coal dust clung to their skin, thickening the air until it tasted of rust and stone. The children held on to one another, whispering in frightened tones, asking when they would go home. No answer came. When they reached the bottom, they found only rough walls, dirt floors, and the smell of stagnant air. A few broken boards and rusted tools lay scattered, the remnants of the mine's former life. Bread and water were left with them, small offerings placed on a barrel that served as a table. "For now," one of the constables said, setting down the last bundle. Then the door above creaked shut. The heavy lock clanked, and the sound echoed down the shaft like the tolling of a bell. The children listened to the footsteps fade. They waited for them to return. Hours passed. The bread was divided into crumbs, the water swallowed quickly, and in the silence that followed, their voices grew hushed, as if they already understood the truth. They had not been delivered to safety. They had been delivered to something else entirely. The first night in the pit was the longest any of them would ever know. At first, the children huddled together, whispering lullabies they half remembered from their mothers, their voices shaking, but soft enough to soothe. Some prayed, reciting words taught to them at the parish, while others simply rocked back and forth, clutching rags or dolls or scraps of cloth pressed into their hands as they were taken. A few of the older boys tried to sound braver than they felt, telling the little ones that food would come in the morning, that this was only temporary. Their words carried no weight, yet the smallest of the children believed them, because there was nothing else to believe. Morning came, or at least what passed for morning. The shaft let down no sunlight, only a faint drip of water that measured the hours with cruel patience. When footsteps finally returned above, a bucket was lowered. Half a loaf, a pitcher of water, and a few apples bruised to softness. The children swarmed the meagre offering, dividing it into pieces too small to satisfy. Hunger quieted their protests, and for a time there was hope. If food came once, surely it would come again. Days stretched into weeks. The buckets still came, but less often, the rations shrinking with each descent. Bread became stale crusts, water came cloudy with grit, apples vanished entirely. The older children gave their share to the little ones, chewing on splinters of wood to keep their jaws from trembling. They told stories to distract from the emptiness in their bellies, tales of fathers who struck seams of silver instead of coal, of houses by the sea where the air smelled of salt instead of smoke. The stories lit a faint fire in the darkness, but only for a little while. The silence of the pit grew heavier with each passing day. The sound of laughter faded, replaced by coughs, by shivers, by the gnawing scrape of hunger. Some of the younger children began to cry at night. not in bursts of grief, but in long, low wails that seemed to vibrate against the stone. The older ones hushed them quickly, terrified that someone, or something, might hear. And then there was the darkness itself, alive in ways none of them had words for. At times they swore the walls shifted, that shadows lengthened even when the lanterns stood still. The air carried whispers, low enough to mistake for memory, yet too sharp to ignore. Some children pressed their ears to the ground and claimed they could hear knocking, faint but steady, as if something far below was calling to them. Still, the buckets came, and with them teet-toot, the thin promise of survival. The children clung to it desperately, rationing every crumb, every drop. Yet deep down, they all felt the same fear, that the day would come when no bucket would descend, when the lock above would remain fastened, and they would be left with nothing but the pit, the dark, and each other. It was on the 12th night, or perhaps the 13th, no one could be sure, for the pit did not keep time, that the first child was gone. He was a boy no older than 7, thin even before the collapse, his cheeks hollow and his hair matted with coal dust. He had been sleeping near the others, curled against the wall, his head resting on his sister's arm. When she woke, she found only the imprint of his body on the dirt floor. His name has not survived in any record, nor in any letter, but the silence he left behind clings like smoke. At first, the children whispered that he must have been taken back home, perhaps fetched quietly in the night by a grieving mother who had changed her mind. The older ones clung to this idea, repeating it to soothe the younger, though their eyes betrayed the lie. No footsteps had been heard on the stairs, no lock had been turned, no lantern had flickered in the shaft. The boy was simply gone, as if the pit had swallowed him whole. The second vanishing came 3 nights later. This time it was a girl, her hair tied with a red ribbon she refused to part with, even when hunger made her hands tremble. She had been telling a story before sleep, a tale about the spring fairs she once attended with her father. When the children woke, her ribbon lay alone on the ground, but she was nowhere to be found. The ribbon was passed from hand to hand, its bright color faded in the darkness, until one of the little ones tied it around his wrist, as if it might protect him from being taken next. Panic spread, though no one dared speak too loudly of it. The pit had ears, they believed, and it was dangerous to accuse it aloud. The older children began to keep watch through the night, taking turns sitting awake, their hollow eyes fixed on the darkness. But the darkness moved as it pleased. The watches caught nothing but whispers, a shuffling at the edges of hearing, a chill breeze that seemed to breathe from cracks in the stone. The missing never returned. Above, the parish claimed the children were restless, that some had slipped away in search of home. Mothers demanded proof, but the officials only shrugged. They wandered, they said. They are gone. No funerals were held. No graves were dug. The remaining children grew more silent. Hunger hollowed their bellies. Fear hollowed their souls. Each day was marked by absence, by the sudden discovery that another face had vanished from the circle. The youngest cried themselves to sleep, while the oldest no longer promised safety. They all began to understand the same thing, that whatever lived in the pit with them did not come from above, but from below. And it would not stop until it had taken them all. The cries began faintly, rising through the earth as though the ground itself had grown lungs. At first it was only the women who claimed to hear them, widows walking ha-ha-wa-da-ha. Om from evening prayer would pause in the frosted lanes, tilting their heads toward the old shaft. They swore they heard children sobbing, muffled by soil and stone, drifting on the wind like ghostly hymns. Others claimed the sounds were sharper, screams, frantic pounding, the scratching of fingernails against wood. The overseers dismissed it as imagination, the grief of women left with too much silence in their homes. But grief does not make the earth tremble. Soon more began to notice. Farmhands returning from fields stopped in their tracks, lanterns flickering as they turned toward the hills. One swore he heard not weeping, but laughter, thin and broken, like a child choking on its own mirth. Another said he heard a chorus of voices humming a tune no one alive could name, a dirge that seemed to seep into his very bones. He refused to walk that way again, even in daylight. Rumors bled through the valley like spilled ink. Some said the orphans had turned wild, that hunger had twisted them into creatures unfit to be called children. Others whispered of something older, something that lived in the deep long before miners carved their shafts. Whatever it was feeding now. The parish grew restless under the weight of these whispers. At meetings, the elders spoke sternly of sin, warning against the spread of superstition. They insisted the children were cared for, that the cries were tricks of the wind, and that those who spoke otherwise risked damnation for sowing fear. Constables were ordered to silence talk in taverns, to warn women at market, to brandish the threat of punishment against anyone who dared repeat what they heard in the night. But the silence enforced above only deepened the dread. In the cottages, mothers pressed their hands over their children's ears when the sounds rose, muffling them with lullabies that shook with fear. Some whispered prayers over doorframes, drawing crosses in chalk, though the damp washed them away by morning. A few swore never to step foot near the parish again, claiming the church's denial was proof of its complicity. And still, the cries came. On certain nights, when the air was still and the smoke hung low, the valley seemed to breathe with voices not its own. The children who remained above grew restless, tossing in their beds, waking in the small hours with scratches on their arms they could not explain. Dogs barked toward the ground, fur bristling, until their owners dragged them away. The earth, once merely a place of toil and burial, had become something else. It was no longer simply beneath them. It was around them, within them, pressing in with every sigh of wind, every groan of timber, every whisper of a voice that had no living mouth. The truth tried to claw its way out, even as the parish fought to bury it. It came not in proclamations or sermons, but in fragments, ink smudged on paper, words whispered in kitchens, lines scratched hastily before the page could be taken away. One widow, her hands cracked and swollen from endless washing, wrote to her sister in a neighbouring county. In a letter. She confessed that her daughter had been taken to the pit and that she had begged for her return. The priest told her the girl had wandered away, but the mother swore she heard her child's voice beneath her floorboards at night, calling her name from the ground. The letter was intercepted at the post house, but copies of its contents lingered like smoke, retold in secret by those who had heard it read aloud. A constable kept a journal in his own hand, though he never intended it for anyone to see. His words were shaky, his sentences fragmented, but they revealed more than any parish ledger. He described locking the children in each night, his key heavy at his side, his ears ringing with the sound of their fists against the boards above. He wrote of how he could not sleep afterward, how the cries seemed to follow him down the lane, rising louder with every step away from the shaft. One entry ended abruptly, with a line that chilled more than any other. Something is still knocking, but it is not the children anymore. A travelling merchant told of being stopped by a pale boy on the road near the mine. The child asked him for bread, his voice hollow and toneless, his eyes like glass. When the merchant fumbled for his satchel, the boy was gone. Only footprints remained in the frost, bare, small, leading toward the sealed shaft and vanishing at its edge. The story was dismissed as a trick of light and fear, yet others began to claim the same, swearing that children too thin to stand were seen walking the lanes at night before melting into the dark. The parish elders responded with fury. They warned that letters containing falsehoods would be burned, that journals would be confiscated, that any man or woman spreading tales would be cast out of the church. Fear silenced many tongues, but fear also sharpens memory. Mothers repeated their stories in whispers, tucking them into their children's ears as warnings. Miners scratched strange marks into their tools, protective signs against what they could not name. The more the parish insisted there was nothing to fear, the more the valley came to believe the opposite. These scraps of testimony were never meant to survive, and yet some did, hidden inside hymnals, tucked between the pages of Bibles, pressed into the seams of clothing. They travelled quietly, carried by hands, unwilling to let the story die. And so, while the ledgers of the parish stand mute, the whispers endure, fragile as ash, but unburned. Inside the pit, time became a sickness. The children no longer knew morning from night, nor how many days had passed since they last saw the sky. Their bodies shrank against the stone, bones sharp beneath skin stretched too thin. The older ones tried to care for the younger, tearing their crusts of bread into smaller pieces, pouring the last drops of water into cupped hands too small to hold much. Yet their sacrifices did little. Hunger hollowed even the strongest, until voices trembled with every word, until legs buckled beneath the weight of simply standing. Whispers began to travel through the darkness, first as frightened fancies, then as steady, fearful truths. Some of the children swore they saw shapes moving just beyond the lantern light, shadows that stretched and shrank even when no one moved. Others said they felt breath against their cheeks as they slept, though no one was near them. A few spoke of hearing their mothers' voices calling softly from the walls, urging them to come closer, closer, until their hands scraped stone. The walls themselves began to change. Where once the pit had been rough with coal and timber, strange marks now appeared in the damp. At first they looked like scratches, the kind nails might leave in desperation, but soon they grew into patterns, circles, spirals, crooked lines intersecting like broken stars. The children argued about who had drawn them, accusing one another in desperation, but none admitted to it. Some swore the marks deepened overnight, as though carved by unseen hands while they slept. One boy, older than most, claimed he could understand them. He would sit for hours with his fingers tracing the grooves, murmuring words none of the others recognized. His eyes grew glassy, his lips cracked from muttering. When the others tried to pull him away, he snarled like an animal, his voice layered as though more than one spoke through him. Soon after, he vanished like the others, leaving only a smear of blood across the stone and the symbols etched deeper than before. The younger children cried more often, their wails long and low, echoing in ways that made the older ones shiver. The sound seemed to multiply, as though dozens of unseen throats answered back from the blackness. To hush them, lullabies were sung, soft and trembling. But even those began to sound strange, notes drawn out too long, harmonies breaking into discord, until it seemed the pit itself was singing with them. The bread was gone. The water was gone. What remained was the dark, the strange marks spreading across the stone, and the unrelenting sense that they were no longer alone. And when the lock groaned above and the bucket finally came down again, a few of the children refused to approach it. They huddled together, eyes wide, insisting it was not food at all, but bait. That the pit wanted them to move, to step into the open, so it could see them better. One widow, desperate beyond reason, could not bear the silence any longer. Her 2 children had been taken with the others, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, and weeks had passed without word. She begged the parish for news, but they turned her away, reciting the same cold line. "The children are safe." The words rang hollow, echoing in her skull until she could no longer sleep. So, under cover of night, she approached one of the constables who kept the keys. Her hands shook as she pressed silver into his palm, more than she could afford. Her voice was low, broken, but firm. "Let me see them. Just for a moment. Just to know." The man hesitated. Perhaps he feared discovery, or perhaps he too had grown sick with what weighed on his conscience. At last, with trembling fingers, he led her to the shaft. No words were spoken as he lit a lantern and lowered the lock. The wood creaked as the door opened, and a wave of foul air rolled out, rank with hunger, damp, and something sharper, something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. The woman descended, clutching her skirts, her lantern's glow trembling across the walls. At first she saw nothing but pale faces staring back at her, children thin as shadows, their eyes enormous and blackened with hollows. They shrank from the light, lifting hands as if it pained them. She called her children's names, her voice breaking, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw them. A boy's face, a girl's braid. But then the light caught something behind them, something that should not have been there. The shapes clung to the walls, tall and crooked, their outlines wavering like smoke, yet solid enough to blot out stone. Faces formed and unformed, eyes glowing faintly, mouths twisting as though they were still learning how to speak. And in the silence that followed her cry, she heard it. Their voices, layered and overlapping, too many to count. They whispered in tones not her own, words that clawed at her mind. She dropped the lantern, its flame sputtering as it struck the damp earth, plunging the pit into darkness. When the constable dragged her back to the surface, her hands were bleeding from where she had clawed at the walls in her scramble upward. She would not speak of what she saw, not to the parish, not to her neighbours. For days she wandered the village in silence, her eyes vacant, her lips pressed shut as though sealed by something greater than fear. On the 7th day, she was found hanging from the beams of her cottage. The priest declared it grief. But the constable who had taken her down into the pit never slept soundly again. And in his journal, in a hand so faint it was almost unreadable, he wrote only one sentence: "It is not the hunger of children." After the widow's death, the pit seemed to grow hungrier. At first the children vanished one by one, always in silence, leaving behind only scraps of cloth or a ribbon pressed into the dirt. But soon they began to disappear in groups. A cluster of 3, huddled together for warmth, were simply gone by dawn. Their bedding lay undisturbed, their places empty, as if the earth had swallowed them without so much as a breath. A week later, 5 more vanished, leaving only scratches gouged into the wall where their hands must have scrabbled in the dark. The others awoke to the marks, fingernails broken, streaks of dried blood smeared across the stone. The older children tried to count the missing, whispering their names like prayers, but the list grew too long. They began to lose track of who had gone and who remained. Hunger and fear blurred faces, until they could not be certain whether the child they spoke to in the dark would still be there by morning. The pit became a shifting place, where nothing was certain, where companions vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Above ground, the parish spoke carefully. Mothers who begged for news were told that illness had spread among the children, that some had perished and been buried quietly for fear of contagion. Yet no graves were shown, no services were held, no prayers offered. When pressed, the priests insisted that the bodies had been interred quickly and secretly, for the good of the valley. It was a lie so thin it tore at the touch, but the women were too broken to fight. The villagers whispered among themselves, though always in private. Some said the children were dying of famine, turning on each other in desperation. Others said they had been taken by the parish and sold, their fates hidden by forged ledgers and false words. But a few, only a few, whispered that the disappearances had no human hand at all. I pointed to the cries still carried by the wind, to the symbols scratched deep into the stone, to the unnatural silence that sometimes fell across the valley, as if the earth itself were listening. The constables no longer walked their rounds with steady steps. They glanced over their shoulders as they passed the shaft, hands tightening on their lanterns, sweat rising on their brows even in the cold. Some refused to go near it altogether, feigning illness or injury. One confessed in a hushed voice that he had stood watch one night and seen something climb from the pit. A shape like a child, but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilting in ways no bones should allow. When he raised his lamp, it dissolved into shadow and slipped back below. He swore he would rather hang than guard the pit again. The disappearances continued, relentless, and with each child lost, the pit seemed less like a place of stone and earth, and more like a mouth, an endless maw that consumed without end, leaving nothing behind but silence and the faint echo of voices that no one wanted to claim. By the turn of another month, famine had become a living thing in the pit, gnawing at their bellies with teeth sharper than any beast. The buckets came less and less, sometimes not at all. When they did, they carried scraps too pitiful to divide, a crust, a withered root, water fouled by rust. The older children gave the little ones what they could, but their gaunt frames betrayed the cost. Bones jutted from beneath skin, eyes sank deep into sockets, and movements became slow, laboured, as though every step dragged chains unseen. In that hunger, something began to change. Words slipped from their mouths that did not belong to them. At first it was muttering, nonsense syllables, the slurred babble of fever. But the sounds carried rhythm, patterns that repeated night after night. Entire groups whispered together, speaking as though in chorus, their voices weaving like threads of a song none of them had been taught. Those who remained sane covered their ears, but the murmurs crept through the dark regardless, crawling beneath the skin like worms. One boy grew stranger than the rest. He was no more than 10, his ribs sharp as blades beneath his torn shirt. He began scratching at the walls with broken nails, at first leaving only ragged lines. But soon the marks curved into symbols, circles within circles, crooked stars, spirals that seemed to twist even when the lantern's flame stood still. He worked tirelessly, his fingers bleeding, his eyes wide and vacant. When the others begged him to stop, he hissed at them. His voice doubled, as though some echo spoke in tandem. The symbols multiplied. Each morning, new carvings appeared in places the boy could not have reached, high upon the walls or deep in the cracks of stone. They glistened faintly in the dark, as though damp with something more than water. Children avoided them, shuffling past with lowered eyes. But at night, they claimed to hear whispering from within the grooves. The language was harsh, guttural, and yet oddly sweet, like a lullaby turned sour. Those who resisted longest began to falter. They stopped speaking in their own voices, answering only in broken syllables that echoed the boys' strange chants. Their gazes grew vacant, lips moving in unison, even when no sound passed. It was as if the hunger had hollowed them out so completely that something else now lived inside their emptiness. One morning, the boy who carved the walls was Go. Where he had slept lay only streaks of dried blood leading up the stone, vanishing into the spiral he had drawn deepest of all. The others could not bring themselves to touch it. They sat in silence, staring at the mark as though it stared back. From that night on, none of them could sleep without hearing the whispers, and when they awoke, their mouths tasted of salt and iron, as though they had spoken in the dark, with tongues that were not their own. Among the few scraps of truth that slipped through the parish's hands, one testimony stands out, written in a trembling hand by a constable whose name was later struck from every record. His journal, smuggled between hymnals, speaks of a night when he was ordered to stand watch by the shaft. The winter air was sharp, the frost biting at his fingers, yet sweat pooled beneath his collar as he listened to the silence below. For hours, nothing stirred. Then, sometime past midnight, the quiet began to break. At first, he thought it the usual cries, the muffled sobs that sometimes rose faintly through the timbers. But as he listened closer, he realized it was not sobbing at all. It was voices. Not one, not two, but dozens, all speaking at once in perfect rhythm. Their tones rose and fell together, weaving a cadence unlike any prayer he had heard in church. It was not the wailing of starving children, nor the muttering of fevered minds. It was deliberate. It was chanting. He wrote that the words were in no tongue he recognized. They scraped against the air, harsh and guttural, yet carried a strange harmony that chilled him more deeply than any scream. It seemed as though the voices were not many but one, an ancient choir forced through dozens of small throats. The sound grew louder as the night wore on, until the very ground beneath his boots seemed to pulse with it. Terrified, he tried to descend a few steps with his lantern, but the flame sputtered violently, as if choked by some unseen breath. He swore he saw movement below, not children, but shadows that swelled and shrank, bending as though the walls themselves were breathing. And beneath the chanting, he heard another sound, slow, deliberate knocking, echoing up through the stone. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, as steady as a heartbeat. The constable fled, abandoning his post. His journal claims he could still hear the voices behind him long after he left the shaft, carried on the wind like an unseen tide. For days he dared not sleep. For each time he closed his eyes, he dreamt of children standing in rows, their mouths open wide, their eyes black as coal, the same chant pouring from them as though their bodies were only instruments for something older, something vast. When he confessed his terror to the parish, his words were dismissed as fevered imagination. His testimony was stricken from official reports, his journal seized. Yet fragments survived, tucked away by someone who refused to see them burned. On one torn page, the last he ever wrote, the constable scrawled a line in shaking script. "They are not praying, they are answering." Not long after the constable's words were quietly struck away, a fire tore through the parish house. It began, so the elders claimed, with a candle left burning in the record room. But those who saw the flames insisted otherwise. They swore the blaze had not spread like a normal fire, but had leapt from shelf to shelf as if the papers themselves longed to be consumed. In less than an hour, centuries of ledgers, baptisms, marriages and burials had turned to smoke and drifting ash. By morning, only blackened stone walls remained, their windows melted into misshapen glass that looked like weeping eyes. The parish declared the fire an accident, a tragic loss of history, and the matter was closed. Yet among the villagers, unease spread, for though entire volumes had been reduced to cinders, certain ledgers somehow survived. The Book of Tithes was found intact, its pages singed but legible, as though spared by unseen hands. And within the records of births and deaths, a single decade remained, though curiously incomplete. There were gaps, entire pages where names should have been, births unrecorded, deaths unmarked. It was as if the ink itself had been swallowed, leaving only silence where lives had once been. Mothers searched the surviving pages desperately for their children's names. None were there, not in birth, not in baptism, not in burial. It was as though their sons and daughters had never existed at all. When they demanded answers, the elders shook their heads with pious sorrow, murmuring that grief clouded memory, that children often died in infancy, that records had never been perfect. But the mothers knew better. They remembered the weight of small hands in theirs, the sound of voices now stolen, the faces now fading in dreams. To see those lives erased from the page was a cruelty deeper than death. In taverns and behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Some said the fire had been no accident, that it was lit to cleanse the records of every trace of the orphans. Others whispered that the flames had come from below, crawling up through cracks in the parish floor, tongues of fire fed not by oil or candle, but by something that dwelled beneath the earth. What remained in the ashes were fragments, scraps of charred parchment, half-legible lines inked in hands too hurried to be official. One such fragment bore only a single note, written by a parish scribe before the fire consumed his page. "Remove the names. They belong to the pit now." From then on, The orphans ceased to exist in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of law, in the eyes of history. They were gone, and the silence of the ledgers was sealed as firmly as the lock on the shaft. But silence is never empty. It waits, and it remembers. By the final weeks, those who remained in the pit no longer resembled children at all. Their skin clung like parchment to bone, their eyes swollen black in their sockets, gleaming not with life, but with a glassy sheen that caught the lantern light like polished coal. They did not cry anymore. They did not beg. They sat in rows against the walls, silent as statues, staring upward toward the ceiling, as though waiting for something to come down from the dark above. The smallest among them had wasted away to silence, too weak to even lift their heads. Yet when one faltered, the others would reach out and hold the failing body upright, arranging them neatly against the stone. It was a ritual of sorts, tender in its way, but performed without words, without emotion, as though guided by an instinct that was not their own. The air had grown colder, though no winter wind should have reached so deep underground. Frost laced the walls, spreading in jagged patterns that resembled the boy. Ye's spirals, the ones carved before he vanished. The marks had multiplied in silence, etched into the stone by unseen hands, until the entire pit was wrapped in them. When the lantern light flickered across their lines, the children's heads tilted in unison, as though listening to some hidden hymn carried within the walls. Food no longer came. The buckets had ceased altogether, as if those above had abandoned the charade of care. Yet the children did not clamour for bread, did not wail for water. They sat perfectly still, their ribs rising and falling in shallow rhythm, their lips occasionally parting to murmur words that carried no meaning to human ears. The language had overtaken them fully now, each voice joining the other in threads of sound that wove into a single low drone. It was not a song nor a prayer, but something older, a vibration that seemed to seep into the bones of the pit itself. One night, one of the older girls, her hair brittle, her hands cracked with sores, stood and raised her arms as though answering a call only she could hear. The others followed, one by one, until they all stood, their bodies trembling, but their faces serene. Together, they lifted their gazes upward, mouths opening in perfect unison. What poured forth was not sound but silence, an emptiness so complete it seemed to swallow the air itself. The lantern sputtered, its flame bending away from them, then died without smoke. When the constable returned the next morning to check the lock, he found no sound within, no voices, no movement. Yet as he pressed his ear to the wood, he swore the silence pressed back, heavy and deliberate, as though dozens of eyes stared from the dark, waiting. He dropped his lamp and fled. In his final journal entry, never shown to the parish, he wrote only, "They are not waiting for us. They are waiting for something else." When at last the parish dared to open the shaft again, weeks had passed without a sound from below. The constables argued among themselves, each dreading the task, but pressure from the widows and whispers spreading through the valley forced their hand. One bitter morning, beneath a sky the colour of lead, the lock was turned. The door creaked open with the cry of rusted hinges, and the smell that rose up was not the stench of death they had braced themselves for, but something colder, cleaner, like stone after lightning, sharp and metallic, a taste that burned the tongue. Lanterns were lowered, their weak glow spilling across the shaft. At first, nothing stirred. The silence was so complete it roared in their ears, a void where breath itself felt unwelcome. Then the men descended step by step, their boots slipping on rime that had spread across the boards like veins of ice. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until one constable swore he saw his breath fogging despite the fire-lit lanterns. When they reached the bottom, their hearts seized. The pit was empty. Every child, every scrap of clothing, every trace of life was gone. The dirt bore no footprints. The bedding lay untouched, yet not a body remained. It was as though the children had dissolved into the stone itself. Only the symbols remained, carved so deep into the walls they seemed burned into the earth. Spirals, circles, crooked stars, all glowing faintly, as if lit from wit. Their grooves damp with a moisture that smelled faintly of iron. The men refused to touch them. One of the constables knelt, brushing trembling fingers across the dirt. It was warm. Not the warmth of life, but of something buried deep, pulsing faintly like a heart beating far below. He staggered back, crossing himself, whispering prayers too fast to be understood. The others refused to look down again. Their lanterns shook in their hands, casting jittering shadows across the symbols, until one swore the carvings shifted, twisting to form eyes that blinked in unison. They searched every corner of the shaft, every niche, every crack. There were no bones, no blood, no remains of any kind. The children had not been starved, nor buried, nor carried away. They were gone, as if they had never existed. The silence pressed against the men until their knees weakened. One dropped his lantern, and the flame snuffed out instantly, as if swallowed. That was enough. They fled the shaft, bolting the door behind them, their breaths ragged with terror. The parish declared the children lost to plague, their bodies disposed of for the good of the valley. But no graves were dug, no services held. The shaft was sealed with timber and stone, boards nailed over as though to cage something in. The elders ordered silence, threatening excommunication to any who spoke of what had been found. Yet silence could not erase what the men had seen in the pit that day. It could only bury it deeper. Years passed, yet the shaft remained sealed, its boards blackened by weather, its stones sinking slowly into the earth as though the valley itself wished to bury it. Grass would not grow there. Even weeds withered at its edge, their roots shriveling in soil that seemed alive with some quiet poison. The parish forbade anyone to approach it, posting warnings of collapse and curses of excommunication. But the villagers still walked the old paths. They could not help themselves. Something about the place drew the eye, as though the boards pulsed faintly beneath the moonlight. And then the sightings began. A farmer swore he saw a cluster of children standing by the shaft at dusk, their bodies thin and unmoving, their faces turned toward him in perfect unison. He raised his lantern to call out, but in the light's glow their skin gleamed too pale, their eyes too black, and before he could take a step closer, they dissolved into the mist. His neighbors laughed at him in daylight, but none laughed when he sold his farm and vanished from the valley the next month. A shepherd claimed he heard laughter drifting across the hills at night, the sound of many voices braided together. It was not the carefree mirth of children, but something brittle, hollow, sharp enough to scrape his bones. He refused to graze his flock anywhere near the parish lands after that, though his sheep often strayed toward the sealed shaft on their own, pressing their muzzles against the wood as though listening. Travellers passing through spoke of small figures glimpsed on the roadside, always just at the edge of lamplight, barefoot, silent, with eyes that caught the glow of fire like mirrors. They never moved, never spoke. When approached, they seemed to step backward into the shadows until nothing remained but frost where their feet had touched. Some travellers swore that when they looked again, the figures had reappeared farther along the road, always watching, always waiting. The villagers whispered of them as the Watchers, though no one admitted it aloud. Mothers warned their children not to play near the shaft, not to answer if they heard voices calling their names after dark. Still, some children claimed they heard singing beneath their windows, a thin lullaby that grew louder if they ignored it. The song stopped only when the children whispered back. The parish, cornered by rumour, responded as they always had, with denial. The priests preached that the visions were tricks of grief, that the dead did not walk. But even they walked faster when passing the shaft at night, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their lips moving in hurried prayers. The children were gone. Everyone agreed on that. And yet, in every whispered account, In every fearful glance, the valley seemed less certain. Gone from the ledgers, gone from the graves, yet not gone at all. Something lingered, something watched, and silence was no longer enough to bury it. As the years lengthened, the story of the lost children ceased to be spoken of as fact, and instead slipped into the realm of warning. Mothers no longer told their little ones not to stray near the shaft, because the parish forbade it. They warned them because of the orphans. The tale passed from lip to lip, reshaped by each retelling, yet always carrying the same core. Children taken by the earth, never buried, never named, and forever hungry. Some mothers whispered it as lullabies, soft and sing-song, promising that if their own children disobeyed, the pit would open and the watchers would take them below. In the taverns, miners carved crude marks into the tables, protective signs said to ward away the orphans' eyes. Triangles, spirals, crooked crosses, symbols scratched over and over until the wood was gouged deep. They carried these signs with them into the new shafts, etching them onto pickaxe handles, onto lamps, even into the walls themselves. It was said that a miner who went underground without one would never return, for the orphans did not forgive those who stole the earth without offering something back. The parish raged at these practices. Priests thundered from pulpits that superstition was sin, that no soul walked after death save by God's will. They declared the marks to be devil's work, the stories to be blasphemy, the mothers who whispered them to be wicked. Yet the more they shouted, the more the whispers spread. For what the priests offered was denial, and what the valley knew was fear. And fear listens more closely to stories than to sermons. A few bold souls even claimed to have spoken with the watchers. They told of voices that rose from the earth when they prayed too near the sealed shaft, voices that mocked their prayers in tones high and thin, repeating each word back with laughter. One man swore he was followed home by a girl with hollow eyes, who knocked upon his door 3 times before vanishing into the frost. He was branded a drunkard by the parish, but when he was found dead weeks later, his body frozen on his threshold with his hand pressed against the wood as if trying to keep something out, the whispers sharpened into conviction. The parish declared such tales heresy, expelling those who repeated them openly, but each expulsion only fueled the legend. The valley grew divided, those who clung to the church's silence and those who trusted the whispers more than the altar. The latter grew more numerous as time passed, for silence cannot shy, pulled a man from footsteps on the road at night, nor from voices that know his name. So the orphans became more than a tragedy. They became a presence, part warning, part curse, part living memory. They had been erased from the ledgers, yet they had carved their own record into the flesh of the valley, a record that no priest could burn. By the 1860s, long after the last boards had been nailed over the shaft, the story of the orphans had become the marrow of the valley. It was no longer merely whispered in cottages or muttered in taverns. It was stitched into the very rhythm of life. Children sang rhymes about the watchers while skipping rope, verses that ended abruptly when elders hushed them, terrified the words themselves might summon listening ears. Miners crossed themselves twice when passing the old path, their lamps held higher, though none would admit to why. The shaft had become both absence and presence, a wound the earth refused to close. Travelling priests began to take interest, drawn by the rumours that drifted far beyond the valley. One young curate arrived from Leeds, notebook in hand, eager to collect the tales as curiosities of superstition. He walked door to door, listening patiently as mothers recited their warnings, as widows swore they still heard knocks beneath their floors at night. He wrote diligently, noting not only the words but the terror in the eyes of those who spoke them. Yet when he presented his findings to the parish elders, he was accused of spreading lies. His notes were seized, and he was driven from the valley before he could finish his work. Another priest, older and less easily frightened, returned years later. He lasted longer. He even stood by the sealed shaft one night with a lantern, daring the watchers to show themselves. The villagers said he came back pale and silent, his once steady hands trembling so badly he could not hold the host at Mass the next morning. By the end of the week, he too was gone, leaving his cassock folded neatly on the chapel steps. Still, fragments of their writing survived. Hidden pages tucked into hymnals told of the valley's strange practices, the marks carved into tools, the children's rhymes that spoke of hunger and silence. One line, scribbled hastily in the margin of a confiscated psalter, read, "They are not remembered as dead. They are remembered as waiting." Meanwhile, the villagers clung to their rituals. They began to place offerings near the shaft, bread, milk, even small dolls, always before dawn, always silently. No one admitted to doing it, yet the gifts appeared, and just as mysteriously, they vanished before nightfall. Some swore that leaving nothing brought consequences. Livestock found mutilated, children waking with scratches across their arms, walls marked with spirals no human hand had carved. The parish redoubled its denials, branding the tales blasphemy and the offerings witchcraft. Yet the valley could not forget. Faith might belong to the church, but fear belonged to the people, and fear is the truest kind of belief. The orphans no longer lived in the pit. They lived in every shadow, every silence, every whispered warning passed from one trembling mouth to another. And for those who believed, that was worse. When fragments of truth are scattered, they are easy to dismiss. A charred scrap of a letter, a torn journal page, a rhyme sung by children too young to understand its meaning. None seem enough to build a story. Yet when gathered side by side, tell more than the ledgers ever dared. It is in the absences, in the missing lines, that the shape of the truth emerges. One surviving ledger from the parish lists every baptism from 1838 to 1844. Every child is marked, each name inked with care. And yet for the year following the collapse, there is nothing. No new baptisms, no confirmations, no deaths. Entire families vanish from the record. Then, in 1844, the entries resume as though nothing had happened, the ink flowing smoothly, the names neat once more. What happened in those missing years was not lost. It was erased. Letters hidden in hymnals speak of mothers begging for their children back, their words trembling with desperation. Each ends the same way. The parish refused, promising safety while returning nothing. A single note, written by a widow's hand and smudged with tears, reads, "They said she wandered, but I hear her knock at the wall each night." The parish never acknowledged such letters, and most were burned. Yet enough survived in secret that the shape of a silence can still be traced. The constable's journals, smuggled past the fire, reveal the most damning details. His account of the chanting below, the layered voices, the steady knocking that rose from the depths, these were stricken from official reports. Yet his handwriting remains, shaky but unmistakable. And in the final pages, before he vanished from the valley entirely, he confessed, "I am guilty not for locking the door, but for obeying the order to keep it locked after the voices changed." Together these fragments reveal a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Records were scrubbed, names erased, testimonies silenced. Fires consumed what could not be hidden. And where gaps remained, the parish filled them with lies of plague, of wandering, of grief. They built a wall of silence around the valley, hoping that time would finish what fire and fear had begun. Yet silence does not bury truth. It preserves it. The absences become louder than the ink, louder than sermons, louder than bells. They call attention to themselves, demanding to be read not for what is written, but for what is missing. And in those missing lines, in those erased names, the truth of the pit survives. The valley might have tried to forget. The parish might have tried to bury. But the record, broken, scorched, scattered though it is, remains. And every fragment points to the same conclusion. The orphans did not simply die. They were taken. And their absence was carefully, deliberately arranged. What then became of the children? History offers no answer, only fragments too fragile to hold the weight of truth. Some insist famine alone is explanation enough. Hunger gnaws at the body, then at the mind, until reason itself is stripped bare. They say the children, abandoned in darkness, turned on one another in desperation, that the vanishings were not the work of shadows, but of hands driven mad with emptiness. When the weakest perished, the survivors hid the remains, ashamed of what necessity had made them. It is a grim tale, but one that requires no ghosts, no curses, no ancient hunger beyond the human. And yet, others argue that famine alone cannot explain what was recorded. It cannot explain the voices heard in chorus, layered in tongues no one had ever learned. It cannot explain the frost spirals that bloomed on the walls, nor the symbols carved deeper than bone into stone. It cannot explain the constable's testimony, his trembling insistence that the children were answering some call beyond themselves, and it cannot explain the silence that pressed back, heavy as flesh, when ears leaned against the shaft's locked door. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the pit, left gaping and restless, awoke something older when the collapse tore through its depths. The villagers whispered that the earth was hungry, and hunger is patient. It could wait centuries in the dark, needing only the smallest breach, the smallest sacrifice, to remind the living that the soil beneath their feet is not still but breathing. The children, weakened by grief and famine, may have become vessels, mouths through which the hunger spoke, bodies hollowed until they belonged not to themselves, but to the pit. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere stranger still. Not famine, not curse, but silence itself. To erase a life from record is to kill it twice, once in flesh, once in memory. The parish struck out names, burned letters, silenced mothers. They buried not only bodies but histories, and what they buried festered. In denying the children remembrance, they gave them another kind of life, one that walks not in daylight, but in the minds of those who cannot forget. In that sense, the watchers are not only real, they are inevitable. Whatever explanation one clings to, the result is the same. Dozens of children vanished, ungrieved by the church, unmarked by stone. Their voices echo not because the wind carries them, but because absence demands to be heard. The pit remains sealed, the parish long since rebuilt, the valley still haunted by its silence. And silence, as history teaches us again and again, is never empty. It is only waiting. The mine shaft remains sealed to this day. The timbers have rotted, the stones have sunk, but the ground remembers. Villagers who live near the old path swear that even now, in the dead of winter, the earth trembles, as though something below still shifts in its sleep. They say that if you walk past on a moonless night, when the frost hangs heavy and the valley is quiet, you can hear it, the faintest scratching, as if dozens of small hands are clawing upward through the soil. Farmers ploughing too near the hill claim their horses refuse to move, eyes rolling white, hooves thrashing at the frozen ground. Some speak of children's voices carried on the wind, whispering their names in tones so thin and sharp that they slice through the heart like needles. A shepherd once swore he saw small figures standing in his field at dawn, their bodies facing the sealed shaft, their backs to him. When he called out, they turned in perfect unison, their faces hollow and pale, before melting into the mist. He sold his flock and left the valley within the month. The church, rebuilt after the fire, still stands in the valley. Its bells ring on Sundays, its pews fill with the faithful, but its silence on this matter has never broken. Priests deny the stories, calling them relics of ignorance. They say no scratching rises from the ground, no children walk the fields, no voices haunt the night. And yet, when pressed, even they will not walk near the shaft alone. Their prayers grow louder where, and they pass. Their steps quicken, their faces pale. They deny with their mouths, but their bodies confess the truth. Travellers rarely linger in the valley now. The land has grown poorer, the people fewer, but the legend remains. Some come seeking it, chasing the thrill of dread, hoping to glimpse the watchers. They stand by the shaft with lanterns and laughter, daring the dark to answer them. Most leave disappointed, mocking the silence, but a few do not leave at all. Their absence is explained away. Robbers on the road, accidents on the cliffs. But those who know the valley better whisper otherwise. They say the pit takes its own time, and when it hungers, it reaches upward. To this day, the boards over the shaft creak in the wind, as if straining against pressure from beneath. And if you are foolish enough to press your ear against them, you may hear it. A faint lullaby, dozens of voices humming in unison, the words lost to time, but the melody sharp as bone. It will sound soft, almost gentle, until you realize that the voices are not singing to you. They are singing for you. And so the tale circles back to where it began, in the winter of 1842, when the mine swallowed the fathers of the valley, and the parish, in its silence, consigned their children to a fate no record would ever confess. The collapse was tragedy enough, but what followed was worse, for it was not only bodies that vanished into the earth, but names, voices, and memory itself. History tells us nothing of them. The ledgers are silent. The graves are empty. And yet the valley remembers. The watchers remain. This has been the forbidden story of the Pit Miners Orphans, a story denied by the parish, erased from the records, and buried beneath stone and silence. But silence is not the end of a story. Silence is a presence, an echo that endures long after ink is burned and bones are dust. In every gap in the ledger, in every mother's unmarked grief, the orphans still live, not as children of flesh and bone, but as shadows carried by hunger, waiting in the soil for the living to pass too near. You might believe they perished from famine, their bodies consumed by the cruel arithmetic of hunger. You might believe they were erased deliberately by men desperate to hide their shame, or you might believe something older, something unspeakable, claimed them in the darkness below. Perhaps all are true, woven together like the layered voices the constable heard, each explanation echoing the other until no single truth remains. But what matters most is not which story you accept. What matters is that the silence itself demands to be remembered. Even now, if you find yourself in the valley on a still winter night, you may hear it. The faint scrape of nails beneath your feet, the hush of children's voices carried on the wind, the lullaby that was never meant for the living. And if you do, you will understand why the parish burned its records, why the villagers still leave bread by the old path, why mothers still warn their children not to wander after dusk. You will understand that some tales are forbidden not because they are false, but because they are true. Welcome to the macabre record. If you have listened this far, you already know that history has a dark side, one that refuses to be buried. Subscribe if you have not already, for there are more forbidden tales waiting to be unearthed. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because the shadows travel farther than you think, and the watchers are always listening.